The train arrived at 5:47 in the morning, same as always. Nina Carter did not look up from her coffee. She had learned 3 things in the 2 years she had been taking this route to work. The coffee from the cart on platform 6 was always burnt. The third carriage was always the quietest, and the seat nearest the window on the left side was almost always empty. She had built her mornings around these 3 facts. They were small and reliable. And she needed reliable things the way some people needed oxygen. She slid into the seat, tucked her bag between her feet, and stared at the dark window. The city outside was still half asleep. Lights moved in the distance, trucks, early buses. The slow orange crawl of someone's headlights on the overpass. She pressed the lid of her coffee cup and watched the steam curl up and disappear. She was 28 years old. She worked as a content editor for a mid-sized publishing firm called Harlow Press, which sounded more impressive than it was. Her days were made of other people's words, fixing them, shaping them, smoothing out the rough places so readers never noticed where the stumbles were. She was good at it. She was also very tired of it, in the way a person gets tired of something they are good at but did not choose on purpose. The train doors opened and closed. 3 people boarded, an older man with a newspaper, a woman in a green coat talking quietly into her phone, and then, him. Nina did not notice him immediately. That was the honest version of the story. She heard the carriage door, heard footsteps, felt the faint shift in air pressure that happened when someone tall moved through a space. Then she registered the weight of him, not his physical weight, but the other kind. The kind that some people carried without knowing it, or perhaps knowing it very well. He was not rushing. That was the first thing. Everyone on the 547 was either rushing or performing a very deliberate version of not rushing while internally panicking. He was neither. He walked through the carriage the way a man walks through a room that belongs to him. Not because he owned it, but because he had never been in a room that didn't eventually reorganize itself around him. He was tall, dark coat, no tie, dark hair, not quite styled but not accidental. A jaw that looked like it had been put together by someone who took the work seriously. He was carrying a slim leather folder and nothing else, and he looked at the empty seat beside her, looked at her, and sat down. Not the seat across, not the one 3 rows back, the one right there. Nina went back to her coffee. She was not the kind of person who got rattled. She had spent years building the not rattled version of herself with the care of someone who knows exactly how easily things rattle. She had learned to breathe from the bottom of her lungs. She had learned to keep her hands still. She was very, very good at presenting the exterior of a person who was absolutely fine. She was absolutely fine. The train moved. The dark city slid past. She read 3 pages of the manuscript she had open on her phone. A thriller about a woman who discovers her husband has been lying about his identity for 12 years, and retained none of it. He did not speak. He did not look at her. He opened the leather folder, clicked a pen, and began writing something in the kind of handwriting that looked efficient rather than beautiful. She caught a glimpse of numbers, some kind of figures, before she deliberately looked away. 2 stops passed. The carriage filled slightly. The woman in the green coat got off. A teenager with headphones the size of satellite dishes got on and took the seat at the far end. Nina finished her coffee. She tucked the empty cup into her bag. She crossed her left ankle over her right knee and went back to the thriller on her phone. The lying husband had just been caught in a bank in a city he was not supposed to be in. The wife was sitting in her car outside, watching his silhouette in the window. Nina understood, suddenly and with some clarity, exactly what the wife was feeling. She put her phone down. Outside the window, the city was waking up. Buildings gained detail as the sky lightened from black to a particular shade of gray that always made Nina think of unread emails. A billboard advertising a hotel chain passed. Then a bridge. Then the long back wall of a goods yard covered in layers of old paint. The man beside her turned a page in his folder. She noticed his hands. She was not trying to notice his hands. They were just there. Long fingers, neat nails, a faint old scar on the outside of his right palm that ran from the base of his little finger toward his wrist. Not new, old, the kind of scar that had stopped being a story and become just a feature, like a knot in wood. She looked away. 4 more stops. She could do 4 more stops with her eyes on the window and her breathing steady and her coffee gone and nothing happening at all. He shifted in his seat, not toward her, not in any direction that meant anything. He just moved, the way people move when they have been sitting still for a while, and his shoulder adjusted and his arm was suddenly on the shared armrest between them, in a way that was not aggressive and not deliberate and not anything except the simple arithmetic of a big person in a standard train seat. His sleeve was very close to her sleeve. Nina moved her arm. He did not appear to notice. He was looking at his folder. He made a note in the margin of something, tapped the pen against his bottom lip twice, and looked out the window. Nina looked at the window too. Their reflections were there in the dark glass, faint and gray. Her face and his face, side by side, watching the city pass behind them. She looked at his reflection for approximately 1 second before she made herself look at her own, and she was very grateful that he was looking at the actual window and not at the glass version of events. At the 6th stop, a man with a very large wheeled suitcase boarded and caused a significant reorganization of everyone in the carriage's legs and bags. Nina lifted her bag off the floor. The man with the suitcase apologized to everyone in a general way and found a spot near the door. The carriage settled again. The man beside her had not moved during any of this. He had shifted his folder slightly to the left to avoid the suitcase's passing wheel, and that was the extent of his response to the entire disruption. Nina had the strange thought that he probably moved through most disruptions like that, a small, unhurried adjustment, and then right back to where he was. She almost admired it. She was the kind of person who catastrophized suitcases. Her stop was approaching. She could see the familiar cluster of buildings beginning to appear on the right side of the track. The old brick warehouse that had been converted into offices. The green glass tower that caught the morning light and held it like something precious. The crooked chimney on the far end of the street that stuck up into the sky like a finger pointing at something no one else could see. She picked up her bag. She stood. The train was still moving, but she always stood early at this stop because the platform was short and the doors only lined up correctly for about 15 seconds. He did not look up. She filed out with 2 other people and stepped onto the platform, and the train doors closed behind her, and it pulled away, and that was that. She walked to work in the sharp cold of the early morning, and she thought about the scar on his hand, and she thought about the way he had sat, that particular, unhurried way, and she thought about her reflection next to his in the window. She did not think about him again until she was at her desk with her second cup of coffee and her screen full of someone else's words, and then she thought about him quite a lot, in small, quick intervals, like someone pressing a bruise to see if it still hurt. It still hurt. She did not know his name. She did not know where he was going. She did not know if she would see him again, though something in her, the part that noticed patterns the way other people noticed colors, told her that a man who sat in the 3rd carriage at the left side window seat on the 5:47 morning train was not there by accident. People who sat in specific seats on early trains were people with systems. She had a system. She recognized the architecture of a system in someone else. She opened the thriller manuscript and went back to the wife in the car outside the bank, and she thought, for just a moment in the small private place where she kept her honest thoughts, that the most dangerous thing was never the person you didn't see. It was the person you saw and watched and chose not to walk away from when you still had the chance. She stayed on the platform the next morning. She told herself it was because she had arrived early and there was no point rushing onto an empty train. She stood on the platform with her coffee and her bag and the crisp cold of early morning pressing against her face, and she watched the train pull in, and she counted the carriages, and she got into the 3rd one. The seat was empty. She sat in it. She did not feel anything particular about this. 12 minutes later, at the 3rd stop, the carriage door opened, and he walked in. He wore a different coat today, charcoal instead of black, but everything else was the same unhurried pace, the same leather folder. The same quality of stillness that made the air in the carriage feel slightly more organized than it had been before. He looked at the seat beside her. She was in his seat. For one complicated second, she thought about this. She thought about getting up. She thought about gesturing toward the seat in the apologetic way people gestured when they had accidentally taken someone's usual spot. She thought about saying something light and slightly funny that would disperse the awkwardness before it fully formed. She did none of these things. She looked at her phone. He sat down, not in the seat across, not further down the carriage. He folded himself into the seat beside her with no particular ceremony, put his folder on his knee, and opened it, and that was all. Nina did not breathe for approximately 10 seconds. Then she breathed. She was very quiet about it. Her name, the full version, was Nina Elizabeth Carter, though no one had called her Elizabeth since her grandmother, who had believed that nicknames were for people who couldn't be bothered to learn the real thing. She had grown up in a small town in Lincolnshire and had come to the city at 19 with 2 suitcases and the firm conviction that she was going to be a writer. She had become an editor instead, which she thought of sometimes as the slightly humbler version of the same dream. You still got to live inside language, you just didn't get to put your name on it. She lived alone in a flat on Morley Street. It had good light in the mornings and a radiator that clicked ominously every evening at 8 o'clock. She had a shelf of books she was planning to reread and had not yet. a collection of houseplants in various stages of survival, and a friend named Carol who called every Sunday and talked for 40 minutes about everything except what was actually bothering her, which Nina had always thought was deeply relatable. She was not lonely exactly. She was in the particular condition of a person who has filled their life with the right amount of things and then finds themselves, without warning, aware of what the gaps between those things feel like. The man beside her on the train was one of those gaps, made briefly visible. She did not analyze this too carefully. On the third morning, a woman with a very loud phone call boarded at the second stop and stood in the aisle just beside their seats, talking at a volume that suggested she believed the person on the other end might be slightly deaf. The man beside Nina did not look up. He wrote something in his folder. He turned a page. Nina watched him from the corner of her eye. He had the extraordinary quality of a person who is genuinely unbothered. Not performing unbothered. That looked different, tighter somehow. A person carefully arranging their expression into calm. He was simply elsewhere, present in his body and in his work, and entirely untroubled by the noise. She found this impressive and slightly annoying in roughly equal measure. On the fourth morning, his pen ran out of ink. She knew because she saw it happen, the scratching motion across the paper that produced nothing, the slight pause, the pen lifted and examined. He did not look frustrated. He looked at the pen the way a person looks at a fact that requires a response. Then he put it in his coat pocket and reached into the inner pocket and came out empty. Nina had 3 pens in her bag. She always had 3 pens. It was a thing she had done since university, when she had once turned up to a 3-hour seminar with nothing to write with, and had spent the entire session trying to memorize everything, which had not worked. She had the pens in her bag. She was aware of the pens in her bag. She was aware of him, and the absence of his pen, and the pens in her bag. She did not offer him a pen. She went back to her phone. She thought about this later at her desk, in a gap between manuscripts, and decided that she had made a reasonable choice. Offering a pen was a thing. A small thing, but a thing. It was the first word of a sentence, and she did not know yet what the rest of the sentence wanted to say. On the 5th morning, he had a new pen. On the 6th morning, she noticed that he always sat with his right leg slightly angled, foot flat on the floor, the way people sit when they are taking up exactly as much space as they need, and not 1 centimeter more. Most tall men she had encountered on public transport sat with their knees spread to a degree that suggested they were trying to claim territory. He did not. He sat as though he had done the calculation once and settled on the answer. She noticed this, and then noticed that she was noticing it, which was its own small piece of information. On the 7th morning, the train was delayed by 11 minutes. The announcement came in the flat, apologetic voice of the automated system, and the platform filled with people shifting their weight and checking their phones with the specific expression of people calculating how late they could now be and whether there was anyone they could blame for it. Nina checked her watch. She checked her schedule on her phone. She had an editorial meeting at 8:30 that she could still make, barely, if the delay held at 11 minutes and did not expand the way train delays sometimes did, like something that had been given permission to spread. Beside her on the platform, she had started standing in roughly the same spot each morning, near the far end of the shelter where the bench was, though she did not take the bench because the bench was always damp. He stood reading something on his phone. She could not see what. His screen was angled away. He did not check a watch. He did not shift his weight. He looked at his phone with the same quality of attention he gave everything else, which was to say, total and without visible anxiety. "The central line has flooding," he said. Nina looked up. He was not looking at her. He was still looking at his phone. "Sorry?" she said, because she was not sure he was speaking to her. "The delay," he said. He tilted the phone very slightly in her direction, as though this was sufficient explanation. "There's flooding at Borough. They've diverted 2 services. This one will probably run to time once it arrives." His voice was low, not quiet because shy. Quiet in the way that a room is quiet when all the unnecessary sound has been removed. There was nothing extra in it. "Right," she said. "Thank you." He nodded, and looked back at his phone. The train arrived in 9 minutes. They got on. They sat side by side in the 3rd carriage, and he opened his folder, and she opened her manuscript, and neither of them spoke again for the rest of the journey. But the word had been said. The first one. After that, things were different in a way that was hard to explain and easy to feel. The silence between them changed texture. Before, it had been the silence of 2 people who did not know each other. After, it was the silence of 2 people who had exchanged one piece of information and were both, separately, deciding what to do with that. She learned the shape of his days by small evidence. He was always earlier in the mornings when he had the folder. Those were heavier days, more notes, more papers shuffled. On the mornings without the folder, he was on his phone or simply looking out the window, which were lighter days or perhaps just different ones. He never had food on the train. He always had a coffee from somewhere that was not the platform cart, which meant he had stopped somewhere before the station. She formed a picture. Not of him exactly, of the perimeter of him. The outline. Carol called on Sunday and talked for 40 minutes about her sister's new apartment and whether it was wise to take on a mortgage in the current climate, and at the end, almost as an afterthought, said, "Are you all right? You sound far away." "I'm here," Nina said. "I'm fine." "You sound like you're thinking about something." "I always sound like that." "You sound like you're thinking about something specific." Nina looked at her houseplants, the one on the windowsill, a peace lily that she had named, privately and with some irony, Optimist, was doing better than expected. It had unfurled a new leaf that week, pale green and slightly translucent against the light. "I'm fine, Carol," she said. She was fine. She was very, very aware that she was only fine in the way that a person is fine when something has very recently begun to matter, before they have had the chance to decide whether that is a good thing or not. The following Tuesday, it rained so hard on the way to the station that she arrived on the platform with her left shoe soaked through completely and her umbrella half inverted. She was standing in the dry section of the shelter, turning the umbrella back the right way and accepting the general indignity of the situation, when he arrived. He was not wet. He had clearly come from somewhere with a roof. He took in her umbrella, her shoe, the expression on her face. "There's a covered route," he said, "from Caldwell Street through the arcade." She looked at him. "Saves about 60 meters of open ground," he added. She thought about the 60 meters of open ground she had just covered, and the state of her left shoe, and the general principle of useful information being offered without any particular obligation attached to it. "I'll remember that," she said. He nodded. The train arrived. They got on. She did not ask him his name. He did not offer it. But he had told her about the flooding at Borough. He had told her about the covered route through the arcade. He had offered her useful things, twice, in the same tone, flat and factual, and somehow entirely without condescension, which was rarer than it should have been. She thought about this at her desk, between edits, and she filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept the things she was not ready to think about directly yet. Outside the office window, the rain had lightened to a fine gray mist. The city below looked washed and quiet. A courier on a bicycle threaded through a gap between two taxis with the fluid confidence of someone who had done this exact thing so many times it had stopped being a decision. Nina looked at the manuscript in front of her, the thriller, the wife in the car, the lying husband in the bank window. She had reached the part where the wife had to decide whether to go in or drive away, and the author had written it beautifully. The wife's hands on the steering wheel, the engine still running, the long, terrible suspension of not knowing yet what she was going to do. Nina read the paragraph twice. She thought she understood it better this week than she had the week before. She corrected 2 punctuation errors, suggested a tighter sentence structure in the 3rd paragraph, and moved on. Outside the window, the mist was lifting. On Thursday of the following week, she arrived at the platform to find him already there. This had not happened before. He always boarded at the 3rd stop. She had calibrated her entire morning around this fact without quite realizing she had done it. To find him on the platform at stop 1, standing near the end of the shelter with his folder under his arm and a coffee in his hand, was the equivalent of a piece of furniture being moved without warning. Her body knew something was wrong before her mind had caught up. She walked to her usual spot. He was 5 meters away. She could see his profile. He looked different on the platform than he did on the train. On the train, she saw him in the compressed, side-lit environment of public transport, which flattened everything into adjacency. On the platform, in the gray open morning, she could see the actual height of him. He was taller than she had estimated, perhaps 6'2", and the actual quality of his stillness, which was more striking in open space where there were no walls to hold it. He had not seen her. Or if he had, he gave no indication. She stood at her spot and looked at the track and drank her coffee, which today, for reasons she could not explain, she had bought from the better cart on platform 9, which was a 4-minute detour but produced a coffee that actually tasted like coffee. She had also taken the covered route through the arcade for the 3rd day in a row, which had saved her left shoe from a repeat of last Tuesday's disaster. The train arrived. People arranged themselves around the doors. She found herself adjacent to him in the boarding queue, which was an accident of geometry rather than intention, and she kept her eyes on the door and her bag in front of her. They boarded. They sat down side by side in the third carriage. She wondered why he was on the platform at stop 1. She did not ask. He opened his folder. She opened her manuscript. The train moved. At stop 4, a group of 6 teenagers boarded, loud and cheerful and taking up considerable space. They occupied the back of the carriage with the particular ease of people who had not yet learned to feel self-conscious about the volume of their own existence. One of them knocked into Nina's bag when reaching for the overhead bar, and she grabbed it, and one of the teenagers, a girl with braids and a very large yellow jacket, said sorry, in a tone that was genuinely apologetic rather than performatively so. "It's fine," Nina said. The girl smiled and went back to her friends. Beside her, he had not looked up. She studied the back of his folder. Dark brown leather, no initials, a small scratch near the lower right corner. She had noticed the scratch before. It was the kind of detail you noticed when you spent a certain amount of time in lateral proximity to something, without being able to look at it directly. At stop 6, he said, "You're an editor." It was not a question. She looked at him. He was looking at the folder, not at her, but in the deliberate way of someone who is saying something they mean to say and does not need eye contact to do it. "How did you know that?" she said. He glanced at her phone, which she was holding with the manuscript open on it. She looked at the screen. He could not possibly have read anything from that angle. "The way you hold your phone when you're reading it," he said, "and the way you stop. You don't just pause. You stop in the middle of a paragraph, look at the same line twice, then go back. That's not a reader's movement." She looked at him for a long moment. "You've been watching me," she said. "I've been sitting next to you," he said, in a tone that treated those two things as entirely different. She decided, for the moment, that she was going to let him have that. "Content editor," she said. "Harlow Press. Fiction, mostly." He nodded. He went back to his folder. She waited. "You're going to ask what I do," she said. "No," he said. "I'm not." She blinked. "Why not?" "Because you haven't asked me," he said. "And you've had 7 mornings to do it." She looked at the window. The city was doing its usual thing outside. She could see the green glass tower coming up on the right, which meant her stop was 3 minutes away. 13, she said. He looked up. Just briefly. There was something in his face, not quite a smile. The near coast of a smile. 13 mornings, she said, not 7. He looked back at his folder. 13, he repeated. She stood up for her stop. She got off the train. She walked to work in the gray morning with her coffee from the better cart, and her left shoe dry, and the manuscript still open on her phone, and the particular, unwanted lightness of a person who has just had a conversation that meant more than either party was willing to say out loud. She was not going to ask his name. She was going to ask his name. Not yet. She got to her desk and opened the thriller and went back to the wife in the car, who had finally, in the pages she hadn't reached yet, made her decision. She read the next chapter in one sitting, which she never did with manuscripts she was editing. She was supposed to read critically. She was supposed to mark the pacing issues and the transitions, and the places where the dialogue felt slightly formal. She read it straight through. The wife had gone in. Nina sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up her pen, a red one, editorial, and went back to page 1, and she read it the way she was supposed to, the professional way, the careful way. She was, she thought, the most careful person she knew. She was beginning to suspect that was not going to help her. That evening, Carol called. "You're thinking about something specific again," Carol said, without preamble. "Hello to you too," Nina said. "What is it?" "Nothing." Nina. She looked at Optimist on the windowsill. The new leaf had straightened and darkened slightly, taken on more color. She thought about what it took for a plant to put out a new leaf. All that energy gathered quietly, invisibly, and then one morning you looked and there it was. "There's a man on my train," she said. There was a pause on Carol's end. Then, "Oh, it's not anything. He's just on the train." "Right," said Carol. "He knew I was an editor." "How?" "He watched me read." Another pause. "Nina," Carol said slowly, "that's quite—" "Don't," Nina said. "I was going to say interesting." "No, you weren't." "I was also going to say other things," Carol admitted, "but I'll hold them. Please." She went to bed that night with the window cracked slightly open the way she always did, even in winter, because she slept better with air movement. The radiator clicked at 8 o'clock. She read 4 pages of a novel she was reading for pleasure. An old one, a reread, the cover bent at the corner, and then she turned the light off. She lay in the dark and listened to the city outside, which was never fully quiet, and she thought about the way he had said the number. 13. Not corrected, not challenged, just taken in. Filed. Used. The word given back to her with his particular accuracy, as though precise things deserved precision in return. She turned over and closed her eyes. She told herself, one more time, that this was nothing. She was not sure she believed herself. But she was very good at keeping a straight face, even in the dark. She would figure out the rest in the morning. She always did. Nina had spent 10 days doing what she did best, which was observing without appearing to observe. She had cataloged things. She had filed them. She had built an internal picture of him the way an editor builds an understanding of a manuscript, not by attacking it directly, but by reading around the edges, noting where the weight fell, where the gaps were. She knew this. He was not someone who moved through the world casually. Everything about him was deliberate. The seat he chose, the folder, the pen, the silence. She had met people who cultivated the appearance of control because they were afraid. She had also met people who were simply made that way, who had no need to perform the version of themselves they were, because it was the only version they had. She thought he was the second kind. This was more interesting than the first kind, also more inconvenient. Carol called on Sunday. Nina told her there was nothing to report. Carol did not believe her. The conversation moved to other things. Carol's job, Carol's sister's mortgage, the weather. But at the end, Carol said very quietly, "Be careful with the careful ones, Nina. They take the longest to open and the fastest to close." Nina said, "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Carol said, and they said goodnight. The second week of mornings passed. The silence between them had evolved again, in the way that silences do when they are inhabited by people who are paying attention to each other without saying so. It had stopped being the silence of strangers and become something else, something with a different texture entirely, like the difference between two people standing in a room and two people sharing one. She still did not know his name. On Wednesday of the third week, she arrived at the platform late. Not dramatically late, 2 minutes, but enough that she had to half-run the last block, which she despised, and she got to the shelter just as the train was pulling in, and she was slightly out of breath and her hair had been caught by the wind, and she was not, in any sense of the word, presenting her best self to the morning. She got on. She went to the third carriage. He was already in the seat. He looked at her. Just briefly. She sat down, caught her breath, and straightened her coat. "The covered route adds 4 minutes if you come from the south end of Morley Street," he said. "But it's faster overall because you don't have to fight the signal at the corner of Fletcher Road." She turned and looked at him fully. This was the first time she had looked at him directly since the conversation about the flooding. His face, close up, was, she looked for the right word, because she was a person who lived in words and needed the right ones, serious. Not stern, not unkind, serious. The way certain buildings were serious, built for a purpose, without ornamentation, and entirely themselves. "You know where I live," she said. "I know what direction you come from," he said. "Morley Street is a guess. A correct one. Usually." She held his gaze for a moment. He did not look away. He did not perform confidence or composure. He simply looked back at her with the same quality of attention she had been watching him give everything else, and it landed on her like weight. "I'm Nina," she said. "I know," he said. "How?" "The package you were carrying last Thursday. It had a name on the label." She blinked. She thought back to last Thursday, the package from her publisher, proofs she had to return. It had her name and firm address printed on the label in the standard courier format. "That's slightly alarming," she said. "Is it?" he said. "A little. More or less alarming than the fact that I've watched you read for 13 mornings. She looked at him. Something moved in her chest, not quite a laugh but the ancestor of one. "Fair point," she said. "Owen," he said. She waited, in case there was more. There was not. "Just Owen?" she said. "For now," he said, and went back to his folder. She turned back to her phone. The manuscript. The wife who had gone into the bank. She found she was having trouble reading. Owen. It was a plain name, solid. She turned it over in her mind the way you turn something over to see if it held its shape from different angles. It did. She read the same paragraph 3 times, none of it went in. 3 days later, on a Friday, the train was almost empty, early, before the main commuter wave. And the light was the particular pale yellow that happened on clear winter mornings when the sun was up but not yet warm. She had been rereading the same chapter for the 4th time, and finally admitted to herself that she was not going to read it this morning. and put the phone in her bag. She looked out the window. Beside her, he was not writing. He was also looking out the window, his folder closed on his knee, his coffee in his right hand. She could see the old scar on his palm from this angle. She had a theory about it now. Tools, maybe, or glass. Something that happened in a practical context rather than a dramatic one. It had the shape of an accident rather than a story. The train passed the goods yard. The old paint on the wall caught the yellow light and became, briefly, something close to beautiful. "What do you do?" she said. He did not look at her. He kept looking out the window. "I run a company that makes industrial water filtration systems," he said. She thought about this. "That's very specific," she said. "Most things are," he said. "And the folder? Cost projections, supply chain reviews, things that require a pen. Not a laptop? Not on the train." She thought about the kind of person who refused to use a laptop on the train. The kind who chose pen and paper for certain work because they had thought about it and decided. Not nostalgia, not habit, a choice. "Why not?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Because the work I do on this train is thinking work, and thinking work doesn't need a screen." She filed that, carefully. The train passed the green glass tower. Her stop was coming. She picked up her bag. "Nina," he said. She looked at him. "You've been taking the right route for 3 days," he said. "But you're still arriving 2 minutes later than you should be. You're leaving the building 30 seconds too late." She stared at him. "You time me," she said. Flat. "I notice," he said. "There's a difference." She stood. She moved toward the door. The train was slowing. "You noticed when I arrived late," she said. "Wednesday." "Yes." "And you knew I'd taken the covered route, because I arrived less wet." "Yes." She gripped the overhead bar. The door light came on. She looked at him. "Owen," she said. He looked up at her. "What would you do?" she said. "With the 30 seconds. The doors opened. She got off. She walked to work in the clear, cold morning, and she did not look back at the train, and she did not know what his face had done after she asked that question. And she thought about that, the not knowing, all the way to her desk. She sat down. She opened the thriller. The wife was now in the bank, standing in the lobby, watching her husband on the far side of the room, and she had not yet done anything, and the author had written the moment beautifully, the wife's body perfectly still, her mind running at full speed, the whole world narrowed to the space between where she stood and where he stood. Nina edited 3 words. She left the rest exactly as it was. The week that followed moved differently, the way time moves when something has been set in motion without an obvious mechanism. Nothing dramatic happened. No declarations, no events, no obvious markers of change. And yet, she left her building 30 seconds earlier. She did not do this consciously. Or rather, she did it consciously the first morning, and after that it became the new default without requiring thought. She appeared on the platform at the precise time she had always theoretically planned to appear, which turned out to be easier than it had seemed. She thought about this and found it faintly irritating, and also found that she did not stop. On Monday, she arrived at the platform and he was not there. She sat on the train in the third carriage in the left side window seat, and he did not board at stop 3 or stop 4 or any stop after that. The seat beside her was empty the whole journey. She read 2 full chapters of the manuscript, which was good progress, and she arrived at work on time, and there was nothing wrong with the morning at all. She thought about it anyway. Tuesday, he was back. No explanation, no apology. He sat down, opened his folder, and said, without looking up, "Monday meetings." "You were in a meeting?" she said. "Early one," he said. "You could have driven," she said, though she did not know why she said it. "I prefer the train," he said. She thought about that. A man who ran a company and could presumably drive wherever he needed to drive, who chose the 5:47 morning train. She thought about the seat, this specific seat, and the folder and the pen and the thought work that didn't need a screen. She thought about the fact that on Monday, when he had not been there, she had been aware of the empty seat in the way she was aware of a word missing from a sentence. Not a crisis, just wrong, an absence with a specific shape. She did not share this analysis. On Wednesday, a woman boarded at stop 2 and stood in the aisle nearby, juggling 3 bags and a coffee, and a very large envelope that kept trying to slide out from under her arm. Nina watched her for a moment and then, before she had finished deciding to, said, "Would you like me to hold something?" The woman looked at her with the expression of someone who is surprised to be offered help and is also deeply in need of it. "Just for a moment, if you—" "The envelope. Actually, yes, thank you." Nina held the envelope. The woman redistributed her bags. Owen, beside her, had half risen from his seat and indicated, with the minimal physical language of someone who communicates efficiently, that the woman was welcome to sit if she needed to organize herself. The woman looked at him. She looked at the seat. She sat, briefly, sorted her things, and stood again with the ease of someone who has been given exactly what she needed. "Thank you both," she said, and moved further into the carriage. Nina settled back. She was aware, in her peripheral vision, of Owen sitting back down beside her, and she was also aware of something she chose not to look at directly, which was the fact that they had done that, the small coordinated thing, without any discussion, without any signal, as if the response had simply been obvious to both of them at the same time. She looked at her phone. He looked at his folder. Thursday was quiet. Friday was also quiet, but a different kind, the kind that felt intentional rather than simply empty. On Friday afternoon, Carol texted, "Anything to report?" Nina looked at the text. She thought about Monday's empty seat. She thought about the 30 seconds. She thought about the woman with the envelope and the unspoken coordination. She texted back, "Not exactly." Carol replied, "That means yes." Nina put her phone face down on her desk and went back to the manuscript, which had reached the point where the wife and the husband were in the same room together for the first time since the discovery, and the author had made the very intelligent choice to not have them say anything important at all. They talked about practical things. They moved around each other in the kitchen like two people performing the ordinary business of a life, and all the unsaid things moved through the room between them, invisible and enormous. Nina thought it was the best writing in the book. She read it twice and then marked it, "Perfect, do not change." That was rare. Most things needed something. Most things could be made slightly better with a word changed here, a line shifted there, the small adjustments that added up to a story that worked rather than a story that almost worked. This needed nothing. She stared at the marked paragraph for a moment, this improbable thing that needed nothing done to it, and she thought about the week she had just had, and she thought, with the part of herself that was always looking for the structure underneath the surface, that some things declared their own shape before you were ready to see it. She had been an editor long enough to know that the right response to that was not to interfere. The train the following Monday was delayed. Not 11 minutes this time, 35. The announcement came with the automated apology and no further information, and the platform filled with the particular mood of a crowd that has been given bad news with no context. A slightly theatrical frustration. People speaking to each other in the companionable way that strangers speak when circumstances have made them temporary neighbors. Nina stood at her spot. She had her coffee. She had her bag. She had the manuscript on her phone, which she had reached a genuinely interesting section of, the confrontation between the wife and the woman who had known about the husband's second identity, and she thought about opening it and decided not to because 35 minutes was enough time to get properly absorbed, and she did not want to be absorbed when the train arrived. Owen was at his usual spot, 5 meters away. He was on his phone. She could tell from the angle of his face and the way his thumb moved across the screen that he was reading rather than writing, absorbing, processing, not responding. After a moment, without looking up, he said, "It's a signal failure at the junction." "You have a source inside the network," she said. "The Delays app," he said. "It picks up the live maintenance logs." She looked at him. "There's an app that picks up maintenance logs?" "There's an app for everything," he said. "What else does it tell you?" He scrolled. "There are 2 engineers at the site. Estimated repair is 28 minutes, which means we'll be waiting 40. "Why 40 if they say 28? "Because they always underestimate," he said. "By a factor of roughly 1.4, on this line." She stared at him. "You've done the maths," she said. "Over time," he said, as if this were perfectly ordinary. She thought about a man who, over time, had calculated the correction factor for railway maintenance estimates on a commuter line. She thought about the kind of mind that would do that without being asked to, just because the information was interesting and the calculation was available. She thought about what she did in long waits, which was mostly read or look at the middle distance and drift, and she thought about the enormous distance between those two responses to the same inconvenience. 42, she said. He looked up. "The actual wait," she said. "Your factor is right, but you also need to add the time to notify drivers and clear the approach signal, usually 3 minutes on top." He looked at her for a moment. "Do you work in logistics?" he said. "No. I edited a thriller set on a railway system 2 years ago. I spent 3 weeks learning how the network operates." Something crossed his face. Something she had not seen there before. Not a smile, not quite, but the precursor to one. The landscape just before. 42, he said, and looked back at his phone. The train arrived in 41 minutes. Neither of them mentioned this. They sat side by side in the third carriage and the train moved and the morning continued. And she thought about what it meant that they had just had an argument about railway maintenance estimates and both of them had been right in different ways. And she thought that this specific, strange, morning-lit thing was something she did not have a word for yet. She was an editor. She lived in words. The absence of the right one for this was notable. At stop 6, he said, "The thriller. Did you enjoy it? The railway one." "The writing was uneven," she said. "The research was thorough. The ending was too clean." "How would you have ended it?" She looked at the window. "I wouldn't have resolved the central question." "Why not?" "Because the central question was whether the protagonist trusted her own instincts," she said. "Resolving it externally, by having the plot confirm she was right, takes the answer away from her. The better ending was one where she had to decide to trust herself without proof." He was quiet. "Did you tell the author that?" he said. "I suggested it," she said. "The author disagreed. It's their book. But you were right. It was not a question." She looked at him. "I thought so," she said. "But it's a subjective thing." "Is it?" he said, and went back to his folder. She looked at her phone and did not read anything for 3 stops. The following Thursday, she found a coffee on the shared armrest between them. Not her coffee. She was holding her coffee. This was a second coffee, from the same cart she had started using, in the same cup style, sitting on the armrest with the lid sealed. When she had sat down, there had been no one in the seat. When she had settled her bag and looked up, he was there and the coffee was there, and she was 3 seconds too late to catch the moment of its arrival. She looked at it. She looked at him. He was writing in his folder. "What's this?" she said. "Coffee," he said. "I have coffee." "That one's better," he said. "Platform 9, not 6. I've been watching you switch over the last few weeks." She picked up the second coffee. It was from Platform 9. It was the correct temperature, just below scalding, which was how she liked it. She had a theory that he had timed how long it took to cool to that temperature from fresh, and had calibrated accordingly, and she filed this theory in the category of things that were deeply unreasonable, and also, she suspected, correct. She took a sip. It was better. "Thank you," she said. He said. She held both coffees for a moment, one in each hand, and she looked at the dark window and watched their reflections, hers and his. The man and the woman on the early train, side by side, both looking out at the city that was waking around them. She had not asked for the coffee. He had not explained it. There was no transaction here, no gesture being performed for an audience. It was simply a thing he had done because it was the right thing to do for this specific person at this specific time, and because it had not occurred to him not to. She drank from the better coffee. She left the first one in her bag for later. She did not say anything else. He did not say anything else. But something had shifted in the architecture of their mornings, subtle and structural and without any visible seam, like a word changed in the middle of a sentence that made the whole sentence say something slightly different without breaking the grammar. She noticed this and she let it be. She was learning, very slowly, how to do that. 3 weeks had passed since Owen first said her name on the platform. 3 weeks was not a long time by most measurements. But Nina had spent years as an editor, and she knew. She had learned it so deeply it was in her body now, not just her mind, that the most important things in a story were rarely the big, obvious events. They were the accumulations, the pattern of small choices that, taken together, revealed a shape you could not have described at the start. She had been accumulating. Every morning she woke at 5 and dressed in the dark and took the covered route through the arcade and arrived on the platform at the precise time that now felt natural rather than calculated. Every morning she sat in the third carriage. Every morning she and Owen occupied the same 2 feet of air between them, and small things were said or not said, and the silence between the small things was its own kind of language. She had started, cautiously, to read it. He was not easy to read. That was the first honest thing she had admitted to herself, sitting at her desk one morning with her red pen and someone else's story and her own thoughts moving quietly underneath. He was not warm in the way people expected warmth to look, not open, not easy, not immediately available. But she had spent enough time with language to know the difference between closed and precise, and Owen was precise. He said what he meant. He did not say more. He did not say less. There was no gap between his words and his intentions, which made him, by Nina's accounting, the most honest person she had shared a train with in 3 years. She thought about this on the way to work one morning, walking the familiar route from the station with the thin spring sunlight starting to warm the pavement, and she thought, that is not a small thing. Honesty that had no gap in it. She had not found that easily before. On the second Monday of the fourth week, she mentioned the thriller. Not in a direct way. She was not direct about things that mattered, not yet, not until she was certain of the ground. But she was talking about a rewrite she was managing. A story whose central character kept undermining herself at crucial moments, backing away from the thing she most wanted, right when she was closest to it. And she said, without planning to, "It reminds me of the Railway book." He looked up. "The ending you would have given it." She nodded. "The one where she trusts herself without proof," he said. She looked at him. He had remembered, not in the way people remembered things they had been told once and politely retained, in the way people remembered things that had stayed with them. "Yes," she said. "Is that what your current author is doing, backing away?" "Every time," she said. "I've suggested 3 times that she's stronger in the scenes where her instincts take over. She rewrites them and puts the doubt back in." "Why?" "Because doubt feels more honest to her," Nina said. "She thinks certainty is unrealistic." "Is she wrong?" Nina thought about it. She thought about it carefully, the way she always thought about writing questions, which was the only category of questions she was genuinely certain of her ground on. "She's right about life," she said. "She's wrong about fiction. In fiction, the character has to commit, not because certainty is real, but because the reader needs to see the decision made. The doubt can stay, but the act has to be chosen." Owen was quiet for a moment. "That's very clear," he said. "It's what I do," she said. He went back to his folder. She went back to her phone. The train moved through the morning light. She thought about what she had said. The act has to be chosen. She was aware of the double edge of it, how it applied to the manuscript and how it applied to the particular morning she was currently sitting in. 2 feet from a person who had bought her better coffee and remembered the ending she had not written and calculated the delays on this railway line over a period of time she could only guess at. She was also aware that noticing the double edge was not the same as doing anything about it. The wife in the thriller had stood in the bank lobby for 400 words before she moved. Nina thought she could allow herself at least that. The coffee became a habit. Every Thursday, without discussion. She had checked, because she was the kind of person who checked. The better coffee from Platform 9 was priced 60 pence above the one from Platform 6. This was not a meaningful sum, but it was a choice, made repeatedly, without fanfare, on a specific day, and she had learned enough about Owen to understand that nothing he did was accidental. She had also started leaving 4 minutes earlier on Thursdays, because she had realized, with some embarrassment about how long it had taken her, that he must be buying the coffee before she arrived, which meant he had to be on the platform at a time when the Platform 9 cart was already open and she was not yet there, which meant he was building her into his morning routine with a precision she searched for the word, she found affecting. Not overwhelming, not alarming, affecting, the way a perfect sentence was affecting, not because it shouted, but because it was entirely itself, and could not have been otherwise. She did not mention this to him. She did not know how she would say it. She was a person made of words, and this particular thing did not have the right ones yet. Carol called on Sunday. "How is it going?" Carol said, not specifying what it was. "We talk on the train," Nina said. "He bought me coffee. He remembered something I said 3 weeks ago." "Nina," Carol said carefully, "that's not nothing." "I know," she said. "What are you going to do?" She looked at Optimist. The peace lily had produced 2 more leaves since the winter. It was, by every objective measure, thriving. "I don't know yet," she said. "Do you like him?" She thought about the word like. She thought about it the way she thought about words in manuscripts, which was whether it was the right word or just the first available one. "I think I respect him," she said, "which is harder to find." Carol was quiet for a moment, then, "That's better than like," she said. "That lasts longer." Nina said goodnight. She lay in the dark with the window cracked and the city outside and the radiator silent for once, and she thought about what she had said and whether it was the true version or the safe version. She thought, both. She thought, that was the problem. On Wednesday of the 5th week, she was late. Not 2 minutes, 12. She had been on the phone with a distributor about a printing error on a new title, and the call had run long, and she had glanced at the clock with the specific sick feeling of a person who has miscalculated, and she had grabbed her bag and run. She got to the platform as the doors were closing. She did not make the train. She stood on the platform and watched it go, and felt the unreasonable, disproportionate disappointment of a person who has missed something that was not, technically, a commitment, and for whom the missing of it felt like more than just a delayed journey. She took the next train. She sat in the third carriage out of habit. The seat beside her was empty the entire way. She arrived at work 14 minutes late and spent the first part of the morning in a meeting she had rescheduled 3 times and could not reschedule again. At lunch, she sat at her desk and ate a sandwich she didn't taste, and read a chapter of the manuscript and thought about the empty seat. She thought, this is the moment where sensible people stop. She thought, I have never been as sensible as I think I am. At 5 minutes to 7 the following morning, she was on the platform, earlier than usual. She had her coffee from platform 9, bought herself today, and her bag and her manuscript and the entirely unnecessary awareness of herself that came from having thought about something all night. He arrived at the usual time. He saw her. He walked to her spot specifically, not his position 5 meters away. He stood beside her. He said, "You missed the train yesterday." "I did," she said. He did not say anything else. She looked at him. She had her coffee in her hand. He had his. The platform was filling with the morning crowd, and the sky above the city was doing the particular pale thing it did in early spring, when the light was coming back but hadn't fully committed yet. "I was on a call," she said. "It ran long." He nodded. "Owen," she said. He looked at her. She had been thinking about what to say. She had been thinking about it at intervals for 3 days, in the small spaces between work and sleep, and the quiet rooms of her flat, where she did her most honest thinking. She had drafted versions in her head with the precision of someone who lived in language and knew that the right words mattered. She said, "I notice when you're not there." He held her gaze. His face did not rearrange itself. He did not look away, did not deflect, did not perform a reaction. He simply received it. In the same way he received everything, completely, without flinching. "I know," he said. She felt something move in her chest. Not the ancestor of a laugh this time, something quieter. "Is that all you're going to say?" she said. "No," he said, "but the train is coming." She looked at the track. The train was visible now, the distant light of it growing steadily brighter. "When, then?" she said. He picked up his folder from where he had rested it against his leg. He looked at her with the expression she had been learning for 5 weeks, the one that was not warm in the ordinary sense but was entirely, precisely focused on her. "Dinner," he said. "Tonight." The train pulled in. She got on. She sat in the third carriage. He sat beside her. They rode in silence for the whole journey, and it was not the old silence, not the stranger's silence or the learning silence, or even the particular quiet that had developed between them over weeks. It was a new one, the kind that comes after something has been decided. She had not decided anything, she thought. She had simply said a true thing, and he had said one back. She looked out the window at the city waking up around them, and she thought about endings that were actually beginnings, and beginnings that looked nothing like what you expected them to look like, and the wife in the thriller who had finally gone through the bank door and found something on the other side that was harder than she had imagined and better. Her stop approached. She stood. She looked at him. "Where?" she said. He named a restaurant, clean and simple and specific, the way he was. 8 o'clock, she said. 7:30, he said. "So we're not rushed." She got off the train. She walked to work in the bright spring morning, and she was not thinking about the manuscript, and she was not thinking about the editorial meeting at 10, and she was not thinking about Carol, or Optimist, or the radiator, or any of the reliable, steady things she had built her life around. She was thinking about 7:30. She was thinking about what it meant that her heart was doing something completely uncomplicated and slightly alarming, and that she was, against all of her careful habits, looking forward to being uncalculated for an evening. She reached the office door. She pushed it open. She smiled, briefly and privately, at no one in particular. She had an enormous amount of work to do. She did all of it beautifully. She arrived at the restaurant at 7:28. She knew this because she had her phone in her hand and looked at it when she rounded the corner onto the street and saw the place. A small Italian restaurant with a warm window and a hand-lettered sign, and exactly the kind of unpretentious front door that suggested the food would be good because the room had no energy left over for performance. Owen was already there. Of course he was. He was standing just outside the door, not on his phone, not checking his watch, simply standing in the way he stood, the particular quality of stillness she had been observing for 5 weeks. He was wearing a dark jacket over a gray shirt, no tie, And he looked slightly different out of the commuter context of the train, which she had expected but still required a small internal adjustment. He was, she searched for the word and found it, present. There was no other version of him happening somewhere else. He was entirely here, on this pavement, at 7:28, and she was aware of this in a way that was difficult to look at directly. He saw her. He did not do anything particular. He did not straighten or perform arrival. He just looked at her with the level, clear attention she had come to recognize, and she thought, this is what it looks like when a person has no gap between what they feel and how they stand. You're early, he said. You're earlier, she said. I'm always earlier, he said. I'm establishing a pattern. She looked at him. Something moved in her face. Is that a joke? It's an observation, he said. About myself. She thought this might be the closest he had come to self-deprecation in 5 weeks of mornings, and she found it unexpectedly warm. They went inside. The restaurant was small and lit with the particular amber light that made everyone look slightly better than they were, though Nina was acutely aware that she did not need ambiance to find Owen worth looking at. This was a fact she had been managing for several weeks and had not yet fully made peace with. They were seated at a corner table, which she appreciated, because corner tables meant you could see the room without having your back to it, which was a small thing, and also, she was discovering, important to both of them. The waiter brought menus and water. Owen looked at the menu the way he looked at his folder. Focused and efficient, not indecisive, not performing a consideration he was not actually having. Do you know what you want? He said, without looking up. I usually do, she said. He looked up. Something crossed his face, not quite the smile, but closer than usual. That's interesting, he said. What is? That you said usually. She looked at him. Most people would have just said yes, he said. The qualification means something. She set her menu down. She looked at him across the table. This person who had watched her read for 13 mornings, and remembered the endings she had not written, and bought her coffee on Thursdays, and timed the difference between her usual platform cart and the better one. You pay attention to things, she said. I pay attention to everything, he said, but not everything is worth keeping. What makes something worth keeping? He was quiet, not evasive. She had noticed he was not evasive, only deliberate. He thought before he spoke, and the thinking was visible if you knew what to look for. Precision, he said. Things that are exactly what they are. Nothing extra, nothing missing. She turned her water glass. She thought about language, about the years she had spent finding the right word, the exact word, the one that did the work cleanly. She thought about the manuscripts she had loved most, which were always the ones where nothing was in the wrong place. I understand that, she said. I know you do, he said. The waiter came. They ordered. She had the pasta, which she had wanted before she even opened the menu, because she almost always wanted pasta. He had something with lamb that he did not look at when the waiter described but ordered with the assurance of someone who had read the menu once and retained it completely. The food came. They ate. The conversation moved, not the train conversation, which had always been linear, point to point. The architecture of two people learning each other sideways. This was different. It had more room. She asked him about the company, not just what he did, but how he had come to it, what the problem was that the work was trying to solve. He asked about Harlow Press, about the manuscript she was working on, about what made a story work in her specific understanding of the word. She told him about the wife in the bank. She told him the ending she had wanted, and the ending the author had chosen, and why they were different. He listened with the same attention he gave his folder, total, without performance. Why do you think she chose the clean ending? He said. Fear, probably, Nina said. Not conscious fear. But most writers reach for clarity at the end, because the ambiguity is harder to defend. It takes more confidence to leave a question open. Does the question need to be open? In that book, yes, because the whole story is about learning to live with the thing you can't fully know. If you resolve it, you've argued against your own premise. He looked at her. He had been looking at her for most of the meal, not in a way that was unsettling, but in the way of someone who had decided the most interesting thing in the room was the person across from them, and was not ashamed of this conclusion. You could have been a writer, he said. I am a writer, she said. I write in other people's margins. That sounds frustrating. Sometimes, she said. Mostly not. I think I'm better at seeing structure in other people's stories than in my own. It's easier to be objective about someone else's choices. He was quiet. What? She said. Nothing, he said. I was deciding whether to say something. And? He looked at his water. You're very precise about other people's work, he said. The railway thriller. Your current manuscript, the author's choices, you have very clear views. Yes, she said carefully. You're less precise, he said, about what you want for yourself. She looked at him. He met her gaze steadily. 5 weeks of mornings, he said, and you said one direct thing, yesterday, on the platform. She picked up her fork and set it down again. I notice when you're not there, she said. That's direct. It is, he agreed. It also took you 35 days. She felt something warm and uncomfortable move through her chest, the specific sensation of being seen accurately by someone who was not trying to embarrass her with it, but also not softening it. I'm careful, she said. I know, he said. I've watched you be careful. Is that a criticism? He shook his head. It's an observation. There's a difference. He paused. The thing I've been trying to work out is whether you're careful because you're uncertain, or careful because you've been hurt. The restaurant noise continued around them. The amber light did its quiet work. A couple at the next table were talking about a film. Nina set both hands flat on the table. Both, she said, but mostly the second. He nodded. He did not push it. He did not ask her to elaborate. He picked up his glass, took a drink, and said, same. Just that, same. She looked at him. She looked at the line of his jaw and the old scar on his hand and the quality of his absolute stillness, which she now understood was not distance. It was precision. He had burned away every movement that didn't mean anything, and what was left was only the real thing. Owen, she said. Yes. Why the 5:47? He looked at her. You could be on a later train, she said. You're clearly not going to a 9 o'clock office. Your schedule is your own. You told me you have early Monday meetings, which means the rest of the week. I like mornings, he said. Before the city is fully loud. There's a window of about 90 minutes where you can think clearly and no one is interrupting yet. You could think at home, she said. I could, he said. She waited. Looked at his glass. He turned it slightly on the tablecloth. She had not seen him do that before. That small, slightly restless movement. It was the first thing she had ever seen him do that was not fully deliberate. There was a woman on the platform, he said. Third stop. She had a coffee from the wrong cart and a manuscript on her phone, and she looked like she was having a very efficient argument with herself about something. Nina felt something happen to her breathing. I thought, he said, that if I got on the right carriage, she might eventually look up from the argument. She looked at him across the small table. That was week 1, she said. Yes, he said. She thought about this. She thought about what it meant that a man who paid attention to everything had paid attention to her on a platform, before she had any awareness of him. She thought about the seat, and the scar, and the pen running out, and the 3 pens in her bag that she had said nothing about. She thought about the 30 seconds. You could have spoken earlier, she said. You weren't ready, he said. She almost said, who are you to know when I'm ready? She almost said it with the reflexive resistance she used when someone got too close to an accurate thing. But she looked at him, this careful, precise, entirely honest man, and she thought about 35 days of mornings and one true sentence on the platform. No, she said. I wasn't. Dessert came. They had not ordered it. The waiter brought it anyway, something small and sweet with the manager's compliments, because apparently they had been there for 2 hours, and the restaurant was closing in 40 minutes, and someone had decided to be kind. She ate the dessert. It was very good. Outside, after, the street was quiet and cool, and the city was in its late evening register. Not the aggressive noise of peak hours, not the silence of very late, but something in between, thoughtful and open. They stood on the pavement. I'll get you a cab, he said. I can walk, she said. It's cold. I have a coat. He looked at her. I'll get you a cab, he said again without pressure. Just, again. She let him get her a cab. She stood on the pavement while he flagged one down, and she thought about the fact that she had let him, and what that meant for someone who had been very self-sufficient for a very long time. The cab pulled up. He opened the door. Same train tomorrow? He said. She looked at him. She looked at his face in the streetlight, the seriousness of it, the precision of it, the near coast of something. Same train, she said. She got in. The door closed. She looked out the window as the cab pulled away. He was standing on the pavement, not watching the cab go, not performing a departure. He was already turning back toward wherever he had come from. She watched until the corner took him from view. She looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about the wife in the bank. She thought about the open question at the end of the story the author had chosen not to leave open. She thought about what it took to commit to a thing before you had full proof. She thought about a man on a platform who had waited 35 mornings for her to be ready. The cab moved through the city, and she sat very still, and she thought, I am not the most careful person I know anymore. She was not sure exactly when that had changed. She was, surprisingly, not afraid. Something woke her at 3 in the morning. Not a sound, not the radiator, not the city outside the cracked window, something internal, a thought completing itself in the dark, arriving at its conclusion without her active participation, the way certain important things did when the rest of the mind was out of the way. She lay still for a moment. She thought about what Owen had said. I thought that if I got on the right carriage, she might eventually look up from the argument. She thought about herself on the platform at the third stop, 2 months ago. The coffee and the manuscript and the internal argument she had been having about whether the rewrite she had suggested to her current author was structural or editorial, and whether there was a difference, and what the difference meant for the story. She had been arguing with herself. He had seen it. He had. She lay in the dark and turned this over very carefully. He had decided, based on watching her argue with herself on a train platform at 6:20 in the morning, that she was the kind of person worth being deliberate about. Not on the basis of anything she had shown him, on the basis of something she was not even directing outward, something private, made briefly visible. She stared at the ceiling. She thought about what Carol had said, be careful with the careful ones. They take the longest to open and the fastest to close. She thought about what Owen had said, at dinner, so precisely. Same. She thought about him on the platform at the third stop, 7:30 in the morning, finding the carriage, finding the seat. She turned over. She looked at the window. The cracked gap let in a narrow thread of cold air and the faint, far sound of the city. The radiator clicked. She fell back to sleep. In the morning, she took the covered route through the arcade. She arrived at the platform at the right time. He was there, at the far end of the shelter, coffee in hand. He looked at her across the platform with the same clear, level attention she had sat next to for 5 weeks. She walked over. She stood beside him. Morning, she said. Morning, he said. The train arrived. They got on. They sat in the third carriage, left side, window seat and the seat beside it. He opened his folder. She opened her manuscript. The train moved. After a moment, she said. The author responded. He looked up. The thriller, she said. The one with the closed ending. I sent her my notes about the wife's arc last week. What did she say? She's rewriting the last chapter, Nina said. He looked at her. She said. Nina looked at the window. She said she'd been afraid to leave it open because she didn't think readers would stay with the uncertainty, and I told her that readers stay with whatever they trust. If they trust the story, they'll sit in the open question. He was quiet. She believed you, he said. She decided to try it, Nina said, which is not quite the same thing, but it's a start. He went back to his folder. She went back to the manuscript. Not the thriller, a new one that had arrived that week. A story about 2 people in the same city who kept missing each other by increments, whose lives were in the same orbit without quite intersecting, until one morning one of them made a decision that changed the geometry of everything. She had read the first chapter on the train the morning before. She thought it was very good. She thought the author knew exactly what she was doing. She thought about geometry, about orbits, about the decision that changed everything not because it was large but because it was made. At stop 6, he said, Friday. She looked up. What about Friday? She said. There's a garden at the old waterworks building, he said. They've been restoring it for 3 years. It opens on Friday. I thought. He paused. One beat. I thought you might want to go. She looked at him. He was looking at his folder, but in the deliberate way. The way that meant he had said something he meant, and was giving her space to receive it without pressure. A garden at the old waterworks building. She knew the building. She had walked past it a dozen times on the south side of the river, the great Victorian industrial structure that was being slowly, carefully returned to something like its original state. She had read about the garden in an article 2 years ago and thought, I would like to see that when it opens. She had not thought about it since. She had not told Owen this. She thought about the app that tracked railway maintenance logs. She thought about the correction factor of 1.4. She thought about Platform 9 and the Thursday coffee and the 30 seconds and the covered route. She thought, he knew. Not in any supernatural sense. He had simply been paying attention to the kind of person she was, to the kind of thing that would matter to her, to the gap between what she expressed and what she meant. He had filled it, quietly, with a Friday invitation to a garden. Yes, she said. He nodded. He went back to his folder. She went back to the story about 2 people in the same orbit. She read 3 chapters. She retained every word. The garden was extraordinary. That was the honest word, and she was committed to honest words. It was not merely nice, not merely interesting. It was the kind of place that stopped you mid-step and made you stand still with the specific, unself-conscious pleasure of someone who has walked into a beauty they were not fully prepared for. The old waterworks building sat on the south bank with its full Victorian bulk. Red brick, tall chimneys, the ornate ironwork that industrial architects used to put into buildings as though they genuinely believed beauty had a place in function. And wrapped around 3 sides of it, reclaimed from decades of concrete and car park and general urban indifference, was the garden. Formal beds and wild margins, old roses beginning to bud in the April warmth, paths of worn stone and iron benches, and the sound of water from a restored channel that ran along the eastern wall. She stood at the entrance for a moment. Owen stood beside her. "Worth the wait," she said. 3 years, he said. "Did you follow the restoration?" "I'm interested in how things are rebuilt," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the garden. She thought about industrial water filtration systems, about the precise, considered work of taking a broken thing and making it function again, about a man who had, on his own admission, watched a woman argue with herself on a platform and decided, quietly, without announcement, to be patient about it. "What made you interested in that?" she said. "Water filtration." He started walking. She walked beside him. "The problem is interesting," he said. "Clean water is not a solved problem. There are a billion people who don't have reliable access to it, and the existing solutions are expensive and difficult to scale. I thought there was a better way." "Was there?" "There are several," he said. "We've deployed 3 of them. It's slow work." She looked at the path ahead, the roses, the water channel catching the afternoon light. "You're not interested in the fast version," she said. "No," he said. "The fast version usually misses something important." She thought about this. She thought about the railway book and the clean ending that resolved things too quickly, and about the manuscripts she had loved most, which were always the ones that trusted the reader to stay with the slow development of a real thing. She thought about 5 weeks of mornings. "Owen," she said. He looked at her. They had stopped walking, without planning to, beside the water channel. The sunlight was doing something remarkable to the surface, moving and fractured and full of light. "I'm not—" She stopped. "Tried again. I'm not very good at this," she said. "Not because I don't know what I want, but because I've been careful for so long that the careful version of me is very—" She looked for the word. "Established." He did not fill the silence. She appreciated that. "The things I said last night," she said. "About being hurt. About being careful because of that. I meant them." "I know," he said. "And the thing you said. Same." "Yes," he said. "I'm going to need—" She exhaled quietly. "I'm going to need the slow version," she said. "Not because I'm uncertain, but because the slow version is the one I trust." He looked at her for a long moment. The garden moved around them, a bird somewhere in the rose beds, the water, the faint sounds of other visitors further down the path. "Nina," he said. "Yes. I've been taking the 547 for 4 years," he said. "I sat next to you on the 43rd day of a routine I had been running since I moved back to this city. And I am telling you now that the 43rd day changed the arithmetic of the whole routine." She looked at him. She felt something move in her chest, something that was not small. "You counted," she said. "I count everything," he said. "But that number I knew without counting." She looked at the water, the light on it. She thought about Optimist on the windowsill, putting out new leaves in the cold. She thought about the wife who had gone through the bank door and found something harder and better on the other side. She thought, the act has to be chosen. She turned to him. "Slow," she said, "but forward." He looked at her with the clear, full attention she had been learning to receive. "Forward," he said. They walked the rest of the garden slowly. They talked about the roses and the Victorian engineering and the problem of urban green space, and a novel she was working on, and a supply chain issue he was navigating, and the way the light changed over the water at different times of the afternoon. They did not rush any of it. When they left, he walked her to the bus stop, which was not on his way, and she did not argue about it because she had decided that sometimes the most honest thing was letting a person do the thing they wanted to do. The bus came. She got on. She looked at him through the window. He raised one hand. Not a wave, exactly. A gesture that meant something more specific than goodbye. She raised hers back. The bus moved. She sat in the back and watched the city go by and thought about forward, which was the only direction she had ever truly wanted to go in, and which was, she thought, considerably less frightening when someone was going the same way. The Thursday after the garden, there were 2 coffees on the armrest. She had bought one, same as always, the better one, Platform 9. He had bought one too. They both looked at the 2 coffees. "You didn't need to," he said. "You didn't need to either," she said. And yet. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. The train moved. Outside the window, the city was doing its usual morning work, and the light was the clean spring light that made everything look like it was about to begin. She opened the new manuscript, the one about 2 people in the same orbit. She had written a note in the margin 3 days ago, at the chapter where the 2 characters finally have a conversation that goes somewhere real. The note said, "This is where it starts, not where it ends. Trust the distance you've traveled." She read it back now and thought, yes, that was exactly right. She read on. Beside her, Owen wrote in his folder, turned a page, made a note. The train moved through the bright morning, and the city opened around them, and the silence between them was full of everything that had been said, and the even larger thing that did not need to be. Nina finished her coffee. She looked at the window. Their reflections were there, faint in the morning light, barely visible now that the sun was up and the glass was no longer dark. But there, side by side, the woman with the manuscript and the man with the folder, on the early train, going forward. She smiled, privately and then not. He did not see it, or if he did, he said nothing. That was fine. She kept it anyway. 3 months had passed. Nina had a way of measuring time that was not about calendars. She measured it by manuscripts, by how many she had taken in and sent out, how many authors she had spoken to, how many margin notes she had written in the careful red of her editorial pen. 3 months was approximately 6 manuscripts, 2 author crises, 1 complete structural overhaul of a novel that had been fundamentally sound but architecturally lost, and 1 book that had arrived perfect and been sent back, for the first time in her career, with almost nothing changed. She measured it also by mornings. 64 mornings on the 547, from the day she had said the true thing on the platform, to today. She had not counted them intentionally. She knew the number the way Owen had said he knew the 43rd day, without arithmetic. Things had changed, not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic in the way either of them operated, but structurally, in the way of a building that has been quietly and carefully reinforced until it is different from the inside out. She had been to his office once. He had shown her the work, the filtration systems, the technical drawings, the maps of deployment sites in 5 countries on 3 continents. She had looked at the maps and felt something she had not expected, which was pride. Simple and clean and entirely real. She had looked at what he had built and she had thought, this is a person who saw a problem that mattered, and did something about it in a way that would outlast him. She had not said this out loud. She had said, the scope is remarkable. And he had looked at her and she thought, from the particular quality of his attention in that moment, that he had understood the version underneath the version she had said. He had been to the flat on Morley Street on a Sunday afternoon. He had looked at Optimist and said nothing, which she respected, because Optimist was thriving now, and also still slightly absurd, and people who felt the need to comment on houseplants were usually filling silence rather than engaging with it. He had looked at the bookshelves. He had not performed the thing some people performed, the scanning of titles to demonstrate reading history, the pointed remarks about authors. He had simply looked, quietly, as though the shelves were a landscape worth seeing, rather than a list to be assessed. And then he had noticed 1 book, thin, old spine, slightly worn, and reached out and touched the corner of it with 1 finger. I know this one, he said. She looked, a poetry collection. Small press, out of print, not something most people would have encountered. Where from, she said. Someone gave it to me, he said, years ago. He did not say who. She did not ask. She took the book off the shelf and put it in his hands, and he stood in her flat on a Sunday afternoon with the old book open, and she looked at him, this precise and careful man reading a poem in her living room, and she thought, I am not afraid of this. It was the first time she had thought that so cleanly. Carol had met him twice, the first time accidentally, running into them on the South Bank on a Saturday, which had produced a 40-minute walking conversation that Carol had later described, in a text, as exhaustively thorough in the most impressive way. The second time deliberately, over dinner, which had produced a phone call from Carol the next morning that lasted 55 minutes, and which Nina had spent largely listening to Carol recalibrate her understanding of what the word serious could mean in a person. He's not what I expected, Carol said. What did you expect? I don't know, something harder. He is hard, Nina said. He's just precise about it. He asked me 3 questions about my work, Carol said. And he listened to the answers, like actually listened, not waiting to speak, listened. Yes, Nina said. Nina, Carol said. Hold on to this one. I'm working on it, Nina said. She was working on it. She was also aware that working on it was not quite right as a phrase. It implied effort, where what she was actually experiencing was something closer to learning. Learning the specific shape of him, the way he thought, the way the careful exterior of him related to what was underneath, which was not, as she had half feared in the early weeks, something cold or shut or beyond reach. It was something careful, the same way she was careful. 2 careful people learning each other's particular version of careful. She thought about this at her desk, on a morning when the editorial meeting had been canceled and she had 3 hours of uninterrupted editing time, which was the closest thing to genuine luxury her working life offered. She was working on the 2 People in Orbit manuscript. The author had sent back the revised version with the confrontation scene expanded, and Nina was reading through it now with the particular pleasure of watching a good writer take a note and do something better with it than you had imagined. The confrontation scene was now not a confrontation at all. It was a conversation in a car, parked outside somewhere ordinary, both characters looking at the windscreen rather than at each other, saying true things sideways because the direct version was still too new to say face on. Nina read it twice. She thought about the train, in the early weeks, and the dark window, and the reflections. She thought about looking sideways at things until you were ready to look at them directly. She wrote in the margin, "This is the scene the whole book was building toward. Perfect. Do not change a word." On the 58th morning, 6 weeks after the garden at the waterworks, he fell asleep on the train. She did not anticipate it. There was no preamble. He had the folder, he had his coffee. They had spoken briefly about a maintenance alert on his company's system in South Asia that had been managed overnight, and he had been awake at 2 in the morning for a call with the site team, and she had said, "You should sleep," with the ease of someone who was allowed to say that now. He had said, "I'm fine." She had gone back to her manuscript. 20 minutes later, she felt the weight. It arrived on her shoulder with the complete authority of a body that had simply run out of fuel and had made a decision without consulting anyone. His head, angled slightly forward as people's heads did on trains, had dropped and then tilted, and then come to rest against her shoulder, with a weight that was precise and warm and entirely unguarded. She did not move. She sat very still, the way you sat when something fragile had landed on you and you did not want to disturb the landing. She looked at him, from the small angle available to her with his head on her shoulder. His face, which was usually composed and deliberate and controlled, was simply resting. Every line of it that she associated with intention had released. He looked younger, not unguarded in the way of someone who had forgotten to perform, unguarded in the way of someone who was, for this small window, simply a person who needed sleep and was taking it. She looked at the window. She thought about the folder on his knee, slightly loose in his hand. She reached over very carefully and removed it and set it on the armrest to be safer, and he did not stir. She thought about the 43rd day. She thought about the Thursday coffees and the route through the arcade and the correction factor and the old poetry book in his hands on a Sunday afternoon. She thought about 4 years of a routine that had changed on a specific morning. She thought, I don't know everything about this person. I know a great deal and there is a great deal more to know, and both of those things are true at the same time, and I am, she found the word, the exact right word, content with that. Content and curious. The best combination. The train moved through the bright morning. Passengers got on and off. A woman with a toddler boarded at stop 4, and the toddler stared at Owen's sleeping face with the frank, unedited interest of a 2-year-old. And Nina met the child's eyes and made a very small face that communicated, I know, same, but we are being quiet about it. The toddler seemed to accept this and looked out the window instead. Her stop approached. She looked at it, the familiar buildings, the green glass tower, the crooked chimney pointing at nothing. She stayed on the train. The stop came and went and the train continued, and she sat in the third carriage with Owen's weight on her shoulder and her manuscript on her phone that she was not reading, and the city passing outside in all its ordinary, remarkable detail. 2 stops later, he woke. She felt the change before she saw it, the small shift in the weight, the return of tension to muscles that had released. He lifted his head. He oriented himself. 1 second, 2, and then he looked at her. She looked back. You missed your stop, he said. I know, she said. He looked at the window. He calculated she could see it, where they were. He looked back at her. 2 stops past, he said. Yes. You could have woken me. I know, she said. He was quiet. He looked at her with the clear, full, level attention that had been the first thing she had understood about him, and the thing she still found most. She had the word now, the right one, most arresting, like a precise sentence, nothing extra, nothing missing. Nina, he said. Yes, thank you, he said. Not for the shoulder, not for the stop, for the general shape of what she had just done, which was to stay. She picked up her bag. She would get the next train back. She would be late to the office. She would text Carol tonight, and Carol would say something that was both accurate and impossible to argue with. She looked at him one more time before she stood. Same train tomorrow, she said. Same train, he said. She moved toward the door. The train slowed for the next stop. She stood in the morning light that came through the windows, and she thought about the wife in the bank, and the Orbit manuscript, and the exact word for being unafraid, and the thing Carol had said that was also the truest thing. It lasts longer. The doors opened. She stepped off. She stood on the unfamiliar platform and watched the train pull away, and she could not see him through the windows at this angle, but she knew where he was, and she knew he was watching the platform go. She smiled. Platform, bag, wrong stop, late to work. She did not mind any of it. She found a bench and sat down and opened the Orbit manuscript and read the final chapter, which she had been saving for a moment that felt like the right one. The author had ended it quietly. 2 people in the same orbit, finally in the same trajectory, no fanfare, no dramatic turn, just 2 people choosing the same direction and moving in it. The last line was simple and clean, and said exactly what needed saying, and nothing more. Nina read it and sat with it. She wrote in the margin, the only thing left to write, on the last page of the last chapter, having reached the end of a story that had taken her across a whole London morning to finish. She wrote, "This is what getting it right looks like. Leave it exactly as it is." She closed the manuscript. She looked at the track. She waited for the next train.